Hey everybody, happy Tuesday. We're back for our summer mini masterclass series. The topic today is that burning question, are all carbs bad? And of course the short answer is like, no, of course all carbs are not bad. But we're gonna start to break down a very complex topic today in today's video. And I want to segue and let you know that next week I'm going to be talking about sugar specifically. So there'll be some unanswered questions likely from today because it's a really big topic and you have a lot of really valid questions. So I just want to let you know that next week we're going to be talking about sugar and more about glycemic index in depth. So it's a great kind of segue. So if there's like a burning question, just kind of hold it for next week. So the question is, are all carbs bad? So let's look at a very complex topic, and I want us to approach it and not be afraid of what we eat. I think that's my main goal for you, is to not be afraid that carbs are bad. Are there differences between the carbs you eat? Absolutely. Does it matter when you eat them? Absolutely. How you eat them? And sometimes variabilities between each individual person on things like the gut bacteria you have in your system. And I'm going to cover some of those things. But what I really want to avoid is you being fearful about food and further demonizing something. Are there better choices than others? Absolutely. And at any time we choose to put something in our mouth, we often have a good, better, best choice. So the goal of today is to be informed, learn some information. Where does this fit for you? And how do I look at what I'm eating on a regular basis and ask yourself the question, is this lining up with me in my goals? So the number one question is, of course, like how much should you be eating? How much carbs? And that in and of itself could be like a full hour-long presentation. So I feel, and I as always, when I'm preparing for this, I'm diving back into the research of like what is current and what is recommended. So if you exercise less than an hour of a day, it's recommended that about 40% of your daily calories come from carbohydrates. So what does that mean? So I did math. So if you are doing about 1,800 calories a day, right? And there's reasons why we don't like fixate on calories, but it's just so we have a reference point of like, what does this even mean? And the beauty is like, once you have a framework, then you can go forward without having to count calories or count carbs, because that's just annoying. So 1,800 calories. So basically what that means is 180 grams of carbs. Now, how do we get into the situation where sometimes we're following advice and we hear conflicting information, and it's very common that you'll look at different macronutrient ranges and the percentage of carbohydrates is actually a lot higher than that. The reason is because most recommendations, like if you see recommendations from Health Canada or any other health agency, they make the recommendation based on population averages. Now, most of us know none of us are average in a wonderful, beautiful way. And one of the reasons why that trips us up, if we're following those guidelines and getting frustrated and gaining weight or not losing weight, or like, I'm following the guidelines, I think I'm eating healthy, what the heck is going on, is if you're not exercising an hour a day. So like those guidelines are based on that you are meeting baseline exercise requirements, right? They're like, oh, okay, based on an average person, they should be eating this much food, they should be moving their body, they should be exercising this many times a week. That's how all those recommendations filter down. And that's why, shocker, we get ourselves in this situation where like, this just doesn't even make sense. And we say things like, this is not working for me. Well, the guideline, again, is meant for the general population, right? The organizations, whether it's Diabetes Canada and Health Canada and the food pyramids and everything, they have to set their requirements so that 80 to 95% of the population, if they follow it, will be okay. Doesn't mean they're gonna be like super healthy and vibrant, but they will be okay. So we have to even look at those recommendations and be like, does this even apply to me? So if you know you don't exercise an hour a day, and if you're eating at higher most of your food is higher carbohydrate than that 40%, then already we're putting ourselves in a position where we're probably going to gain weight, right? So what's the bad thing about carbs, like what's the thing we're worried about and we're scared about, is obviously weight gain and the proverbial muffin top, right? Is that how where muffin top came from? Is like, eat too many muffins, you get this muffin top. Is if we're having a lot of carbohydrates and our blood sugar is getting too high. Our blood sugar is unstable and it causes higher levels of insulin, which will lead to insulin resistance down the road, which will lead to weight gain. A lot of times in those in between times, even years before we really realize what's going on, it affects our mood. It affects our ability to keep our emotions stable. It affects being hangry and losing it and snapping with our kids. It affects our anxiety levels. It affects depression levels. People who have, I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and the gentleman basically like prescribes different diets for people for mental health, and the research is amazing, right? But like there's reasons why a lot of times ketogenic diets will be prescribed for people who are struggling with mental illness, because we know the meds on their own aren't doing enough, right? People are still taking the meds and still are depressed and are still struggling. So with that, since I mentioned ketogenic diet, I don't recommend a ketogenic diet unless it's specifically prescribed for you for a specific reason, something like that. And one of the reasons that it's not sustainable for most of us, and it can be really, really taxing on the liver. And most of the times how I see a lot of people doing keto is like, they think, a lot of times they're going to like what they consider like fun foods, and they can find themselves in a situation where actually consuming a lot of like really not great oils, which is not good for our liver. And so that I don't want happening to any of you. So sleep, if we're not eating enough if we're not eating enough carbohydrates, and if our blood sugar is not stable, if we're having too many carbohydrates, it will affect our sleep as well. So energy, sleep, mood, emotional stability, and then weight gain. Those would be symptoms that, am I having too many carbohydrates? And it's not even too many. It is also the what of the carbohydrate. Okay. So carbohydrates are in foods, like we first line think of it is things like in our grains and our pastas and our breads and our fruits. So we want to, whenever we're having carbohydrates, of course, choose whole food, right? Choose whole food, choose legumes and whole grains and pasta and fruit and vegetables. Those are going to be our best sources of carbohydrates. So there's a very real difference if I have, again, I'll pull the numbers, right? So 1 cup of raspberries has 15 grams of carbohydrate. One typical muffin has 54 grams of carbohydrate. So as my morning snack, if I chose a cup of raspberries, 15 grams of carbs. Again, my body needs carbs. And I think that's a big myth, is that the lower the carb, the better. Like if we're trying to lose weight, the lower the carb, the better, which is not, I would say that's not true. And as women, we need those good, healthy carbs to prevent cravings, to actually regulate our blood sugar level. The more stable our blood sugar is, the easier is all our hormones are to stay in line. So our blood sugar is not stable, our adrenal glands have to work really, really hard, and then all the other hormones downstream are going to suffer to stay in line. So yes, as women, we absolutely need carbohydrates. But so if I have my morning snack, 15 grams of carbohydrates from a raspberry, and a muffin, which would have been 54 grams of carbs, like volume-wise, about the same type of food, very different effect on my body, let alone the glycemic index. So I want to talk about something that's called, I'll talk about the glycemic index, and again, I'll dive more into that next week when we talk about sugar specifically. But glycemic index is an index that tells us something with carbohydrates, something that's broken down to sugar in our body, how quickly that happens. So generally, we want to choose foods that are lower glycemic index. Foods that are higher glycemic index, if I take it in, might have the same amount of carbohydrates, right? So this is where calorie is not a calorie. We need to move beyond just the calorie or the grams of carbohydrate. If food A has a higher glycemic index, that sugar is going to get broken down faster. It's going to go into my bloodstream faster. It's going to spike my blood sugar fast. So I'm going to have a bigger blood sugar spike from the same amount of carbohydrates versus something that was a lower glycemic index food. It will get digested slower in my digestive tract. It will still get absorbed, but rather than it's like being dumped in. It's just like a nice, low, steady. So there's a term called slow carb, and that's where the foods on the slow carb list are mostly lower glycemic index foods. There's another term that's also called resistant starches. So resistant starches, by the name, is the carbohydrates in that, the starch is the source of carbohydrate. They're resistant to getting broken down in our small intestine. They get broken down in our large intestine, our large colon, and they feed our good bacteria. So those foods, again, are usually slow carbs. So you'll see the same foods on those lists, and they're lower glycemic index foods. I mentioned gut bacteria. So if you're someone if you look at the slow carb list, the resistant starches list, there's things like legumes, there's beans, and those are great sources of slow carb foods because they're also packed with a lot of fiber. And this is why if we go like no carb, low carb, we usually don't have enough fiber. And as ladies, we should be having 30 grams of fiber or more per day. Now, if you look at a fiber-rich food and you're like, that is going to give me gas and make me bloated, that's where we need to address. So I talk about some of these foods, especially like the beans and the legumes, and even some of the vegetables, right? Like broccoli. And again, those are what we consider healthy foods, right? I try not to say like, oh, this is a good food, this is a bad food. There's definitely foods we want more of and definitely foods we want less of. So if you would have something like legumes and you're like, even just thinking about that, I get gassy. So there's a few things that potentially going on. One, there's genetic differences. Some people just don't digest those type of foods as well. There's differences, geographic differences, depending on our heritage of what our ancestors grew up eating. If my white Northern European ancestors didn't have a lot of like lentils, right? Like I might not have the same digestive enzymes as somebody else of Southeast Asian descent who they've been eating that forever. So there's very real genetic differences in the foods we can accommodate, right? So if there might be a digestive enzyme issue. You might not make certain digestive enzymes for certain types of food. So if you know that it's a food you would like to eat, or you enjoy the food, that's important thing. It's like if you enjoy the food, but you're like, yeah, it kind of causes me gassy, you might benefit from a certain type of a digestive enzyme that might help you break down that food, right? We always want to pay attention to our whole digestive system health. Probiotics play a role, but sometimes if we get like really gassy, so normally in our small intestine, there shouldn't be a whole lot of bacteria. Most of our bacteria should be in our large intestine. Small intestine should be pretty clear. So a sign that you have an issue in the small intestine is that if you get bloated or gassy 1 to 2 hours after you eat. Because if you eat, food goes into your stomach, goes into the small intestine, right? So that's telling me there's something more probably in the small intestine that's causing that gas or bloating if it's happening pretty soon after your meals. So if you were to look at the resistant fiber list or the slow carb list and you're like, oh my goodness, or if you start eating those foods and you notice like you get gas or bloating, how often do you have bowel movement, right? Make sure you're having a bowel movement on a regular basis. Make sure we're getting enough fiber, make sure we're getting enough water. And then that would be a situation where for the right person, we might recommend certain probiotics or again, digestive enzymes. So knowing a little bit, this is where it's not like just some foods is like a no for somebody, and some foods is, okay, what is actually going on and can we support this so that you can just eat the food you want, that you lay out, you're like, oh yeah, this is the food I know and like, and I got a rhythm, I got a routine, right? And that's what I like, is when we can relax and just the pressure of, again, not being afraid of food and having like a template of like, okay, I know I eat this, this, and this, and that's what I focus on most of my time, and I feel good, and my energy's good, and I sleep good, and I maintain my weight when I am doing this. So I mentioned already the 40% of your calories from carbs is what's recommended if you exercise less than an hour a day. So if you fall in that camp, I exercise less than an hour a day, and you've been following other guidelines, which is very common to see guidelines of up to 60% of your calories from carbs. again, not your fault. It wasn't the right information for where you were at. If you're working out 1 to 2 hours a day, that's when it's recommended to increase to about 45% of your calories to come from carbohydrates. So definitely on days that I work out harder or longer, or do like 2 workouts in a day, like maybe I work out with my trainer and then go for a kayak after. Those are days like for sure I'm having extra carbohydrates that day to fuel my muscles. So we want to look at the sugar effect of the carbohydrates, and how we can do that is choose foods with like on the lower glycemic index. So those are fruits, vegetables. So, and even the fruits like berries, apples, with a little more fiber, they're lower glycemic index. Bananas are a contentious one, right? So bananas, like, it's like, oh, you can't eat bananas. So bananas are a higher glycemic index food. Overall carb count, there's still less carbs in a banana than in a typical muffin that you would get anywhere. So less carbs, and this is a situation where we're just like, so many of us have conditioned ourselves to think like a banana is bad, right? And it's true, most bananas are actually like 2 servings of fruit. So sometimes it's the volume that we're eating, because like banana is convenient. I actually have one sitting over there. A banana is convenient, but sometimes it's the size, like, oh, this is actually technically 2 servings of fruit. So like if I'm putting a banana in my smoothie after a workout, I just put half a banana in it. Okay. So it's like how many carbohydrates, and then what is the effect on that? And then further, what is the timing of that? So when are you going to have your carbs? So I find for women specifically, if you're having trouble sleeping, if you have hormonal issues, having your slower carbs like in the evening. Like, so I love sweet potatoes. Plantains are another like surprise. It's like a surprise food. So because when you think of like a banana and a plantain, they look pretty much the same, but they're very different. Plantains have a lot of that resistant starch, so they're very low glycemic index. So plantains are actually a great thing to have as meals. When I went to Dominican Republic a couple years ago, like I went to the market and like I was having plantains every day. They were delicious. So having those slow carbs in the evening at your supper meal to maintain your blood sugar. Why? Again, the benefit is that they're going to release slowly into your bloodstream to keep your blood sugar stable, which if you're waking up at night, a lot of times for women, it's an issue that your blood sugar is dropping, right? So if you've had more higher glycemic index type carbs, a few hours after, it's common for the blood sugar to drop. And when that happens, that often will wake us up. So having those slow carb carbohydrates, not sure why I'm having trouble with that, maybe I need a sip of coffee, can be helpful. And that alone can be a game changer for people to be like, oh my gosh, I'm all of a sudden sleeping through the night. I used to wear and this is like, how do you know, right? How do you know? I've talked about continuous glucose monitors before. So that's one way to know is like, what's the effect of this carbohydrate in me and my body and what I'm doing? So I don't have one on right now, but so the continuous glucose monitors in Canada, you can get the Freestyle Libre. You can order it online. You can go to any pharmacy and get it. In the US, you technically need a prescription for them. There's other services like Levels, and usually you can do it online. They'll make sure you get the script to do it. So the continuous glucose monitor you wear on the back of your arm. And what I found was I was waking up at night, and it's because my blood sugar was dropping low. I'm like, oh, okay. So I was just like, oh, I didn't think it was a big deal because I'd wake up 2 times a night, maybe 3, on average 2, go to the bathroom and go back to sleep. It wasn't really affecting my sleep. And then when I was wearing the blood sugar monitor, when I would check it, it was just like, oh, I'm waking up because my blood sugar is too low. So that's a body response to wake you up as a survival mechanism. And so stabilizing that blood sugar, having the right food to keep the blood sugar stable longer, super, super important. All right, if you have any questions, put them into the comments. And for those of you watching the replay, because I know there'll be lots watching the replay, put your questions in the comments and I will answer them. And then again, I'm going to be talking about sugar specifically next week. So there will be a carryover of this conversation. So I like that it's a good starter, right? So in sum, are carbs bad? Are all carbs bad? No. We want to make sure we're having the right amount, a reasonable amount. Like we do need some, right? If you're like, oh, I'm just eating salad, I'm just eating protein, and avoiding fruit and I'm not adding extra like lentils and stuff to my salads, that's where we get in the situation where we get like really hangry and our body will respond and like cravings that we can't control later on, right? If your mood is not stable, if your mood is not stabilized, nutrition and stabilizing blood sugar is like number one. So you can even think, okay? So you can even think, because a lot of times it's just like your brain is not even fueled properly, right? Sugar is our fastest energy source. So if you are struggling with energy, how do we give your body a stable supply of that energy source without being like a crash and burn? One thing I would always recommend to avoid is drinking your calories, drinking your carbohydrates. Now, a good balanced smoothie is the exception, as long as it's got about 30 grams of protein. So that would be the exception. But other than that, really try not to drink your calories, drink your carbohydrates. And I'll talk more about like things like honey next week, right? But I'm giving you some numbers. Like, for instance, like a tablespoon of honey is 17 grams of carbs, right? And the issue with liquid sugar like that is it just goes right into our bloodstream, okay? And how easy is it to put, if you're having 3 cups of tea during the day, how easy is it to put like 3 tablespoons of honey, right? Or 3 tablespoons of sugar, having all the different sources of sugar. So try not to drink your calories or your carbohydrates. That is like, it just goes straight into your system, right? If you're having, obviously you're having soda, if you're having fruit juice, there's nothing to break down because there's no fiber with it. So any of the sugar in there, it basically just has green light right into your system. So we're gonna have usually a blood sugar spike along with that. All right, so I talked about glycemic index. I talked about really what it is that we're concerned about, and most of us wanted to know with weight gain. So in terms of if you're here to balance your hormones and to maintain a healthy weight or to lose weight, that's where I really recommend that macro breakdown of 30% of your daily calories, 30% from protein, 30% from fat, 40% from carbohydrate. And I find that the reason why I like it, it's very similar to any Mediterranean diet style, and it's very sustainable. That's why I love it, because it has to be sustainable. Like, it has to not be a quick fix. It's not like a crash and burn thing. That is, I guarantee you, like I see some people watching this, like they know that that's a sustainable ratio once they figure out what works for them. And that's the game changer, is like figuring out what works for your body. I talked a little bit about gut bacteria. Again, if you know things are off, you have those symptoms of like getting really gassy or bloating with some of these higher fiber foods. It's one of the reasons why we need carbohydrates, right? We need the fiber for our gut health, for our body to detox so we can be eliminating efficiently. And we need that nice, stable fuel supply for all of our cells, and especially our brain cells. So thanks for tuning in to today's topic. Are all carbs bad? Of course, the answer is no. I would love you to choose wisely. Choose the whole grains, the whole foods. That's going to be the best. Avoiding processed sugar, avoiding overly processed foods. Don't be afraid of a banana, but there's always going to be a time and place, right? So for the banana question, right? So like any fruit, any of your life, I've fact checked on myself with the glucose monitor, right? So like when I was wearing the glucose monitor, I would eat an apple. So just an apple, which reasonable amount of carbohydrates, moderate glycemic index, my blood sugar would spike. Now this is me, it might not be the same effect for you. I have different bacteria than you. Our days would have been different. How you sleep affects it. Your stress levels affect it, right? That's where it's like, there's so many variables. So an apple on its own would give me a blood sugar spike. Not like crazy high, but enough that's like, okay, yeah, it definitely like went up there quite a bit more than I expected. Now, if I have that apple, then I would experiment. I'd have the apple with some nuts or some seeds, stable. So I took the apple and then paired it with some healthy fat. So you can have it with some healthy fat or some protein, and that will help stabilize it, right? So like I very rarely will eat a banana on its own. If I'm doing a little bit of banana in my smoothie, guess what? I'm throwing greens in there as well. Like I'm throwing spinach in there, so there's like extra fiber in there, and I'm throwing I'm making sure there's protein in there as well. So learning, and we'll talk about this more next week with the sugar, is like how you can eat things that are, again, foods have carbohydrates in it, right? So it's like not avoiding it. We can eat those things and help keep our blood sugar stable. So that's really, at the end of the day, really this is going to be the main driver for our health and how we're feeling, is keeping that blood sugar stable. So you can eat a lot of these foods, and I'll share some of those tips and tricks next week when we dive into all about sugar. So I hope you're finding these little conversations, these mini master classes helpful. I appreciate your comments and questions. And again, any follow-up questions I will address next week when we talk about sugar. So have a super day wherever you're joining me from, and make it a good one, and go enjoy some delicious, delicious food today. See you later.